Hier ist das erste deutsche Fernsehen mit der Tagesschau.
One of the most misunderstood concepts of the current era seems to be that of virus isolation. Not a week goes by in which someone doesn't ask me to clarify what is going on, and I don't blame them because even the scientific literature is a mess. This video will look into some of the modern and historical aspects of the issue and why the terms isolation and isolate do not mean what many people think. The problem is when a virologist says we've isolated the virus, it implies a finality that needs no question. I'm not even sure if many virologists and scientists are aware of what they're doing anymore, and you're unlikely to hear any journalists call them up on the details. Although sometimes...
Well, you isolate a virus by
As a little introduction, we should quickly establish the definition of a virus. Essentially, it refers to a tiny infectious particle inside of which is some genetic material, which may be DNA or RNA. As I've discussed in previous videos, the purported SARS-CoV-2 PCR tests are supposed to react to RNA sequences specific to the virus. But before validating these tests for any use, it would need to be established that the RNA comes from inside the virus particle. That's because viruses only grow in cells, and cells already contain enormous amounts of genetic material. So first they have to be separated, otherwise you won't know what's in your mixture. That's where virus isolation comes in, and you might be in for a surprise as the language being used by the virologists is a little murky to say the least. So firstly, the word isolated derives from the Latin word insulatus, meaning to be made into an island. Now let's consult the dictionary to see what these terms are usually understood to mean today. So recently, many people got to experience the first definition of isolation, although you may not have been officially called a prisoner. Anyway, isolation means the fact that something is separate and not connected to other things. So I think we could say that using this definition, we would expect that isolation of a microorganism or virus would mean that it has been separated from other biological material and we are left with just the object of interest. And if we look up the dictionary for isolate, we see that with regards to chemistry and bacteriology, the verb means to obtain a substance or microorganism in an uncombined or pure state. And with regards to the noun, it means a person, thing or group that is set apart or isolated as for purposes of study. However, once you start searching for definitions of isolation with regards to viruses, you are unlikely to find such clear-cut terminology. In fact, some might say you are getting an introduction into a little secret of virology. And the year 2020 saw the issue become much more public as many more people became aware of the terms and techniques that virologists are using.
And it was working fine till you gang of snoopers came around.
I'm going to quote Vincent Racaniello, Earth's virology professor, a few times to illustrate some of the problems. Now, my opinions about fundamental principles of what are termed viruses and how they relate to disease differ sharply from Professor Racaniello, as he is part of the orthodox school, but I find him more internally consistent than many virologists. Despite the fundamental differences in belief, you could even say I have a soft spot for him, and if you want to learn about establishment virology theories, then he's worth checking out. However, as we're about to see, even the professor seems to start well, but then gets loose with the language when talking about viral isolates. So what does he say about the terminology in current use? Many people are thinking about viruses, and so they're using terms they may not be familiar with, like isolate, variant, and strain. Racaniello points out how most of the time in the field of virology, doctors and scientists simply parrot the terms that those who influence them are using, which may or may not have any consistency. He states, unfortunately, there is no universally accepted definitions for the terms strain, variant, and isolate in the virology community, and most virologists simply copy the usage of terms from others. Interestingly, Racaniello goes on to say that even in the 4th edition of his textbook, Principles of Virology, he and his co-authors had neglected to clarify these terms, something they will perhaps look to do in a future edition. I think you can already see that there is a major problem here. We expect scientific language to be very precise. For example, in the field of aerospace engineering, you wouldn't want the scientists to have loose definitions of important terms such as acceleration and centre of gravity. In the past year, we have seen numerous papers reporting that they had isolated a certain famous virus. Subsequently, fact-checkers and mainstream media acolytes posted on their social media accounts that only a conspiracy theorist would claim that the virus hadn't been isolated. But it's already clear that the use of the term isolation is anything but clear, and many of the angry messages aimed at conspiracy theorists seem to be by those perhaps not understanding how the word isolated was being used. That is why my co-author, Torsten Engelbrecht, made a point of contacting those authors who had claimed to have first identified or isolated the purported virus to see if they had purified samples. We published our findings in the recently released updated version of Virus Mania, and as many of you will know, none of the study authors claimed to have obtained the virus in purified form. Now, if we go back to our dictionary definition of isolate, which is to obtain a substance or microorganism in an uncombined or pure state, we can see that people are confused, or at least talking about very different things, because nobody has produced an uncombined or pure state sample. Other investigators were also aware of the inconsistent ways in which isolation was being used. Here in New Zealand, the media reported in mid-2020 that Professor Quinone Matteau of Otago University was able to grow the SARS-CoV-2 virus and isolate its RNA, its genetic material. However, Canadian researcher Christine Massey and New Zealander Michael S. have been submitting Freedom of Information requests to health institutions around the world. When they made an Official Information Act request to Otago University, they were advised that the university in fact had no records of any study describing the actual purification of the alleged virus. Okay, it's time to get some more lessons from Professor Racaniello to see if a representative from the orthodoxy can tidy up their mess. He says, an isolate is a virus that we have isolated from an infected host, and we have propagated that in culture. You put that sample in cells and culture, which is how we grow viruses. And you grow virus, and now you have an isolate. All right, I think we might have hit some major problems here. He's implying that someone spits in a cup, and if you mix it with a cell culture, hey presto, we've isolated a virus. That doesn't sound like isolation at all, because we're dealing with samples and culture mediums that contain all kinds of substances, without any mention of purification. With regards to this, in Virus Mania, we quote Nobel laureate virologist Françoise Barré-Sinoussi as saying, you have to purify the virus from all this mess. Professor Racaniello goes on to say that most of the time we take this nasopharyngeal swab in the solution, we just do the genome sequence, and we don't actually have a physical isolate virus, and that's very important. Okay, so that's a big concession. He admits many of these so-called isolates are simply detecting genetic sequences from crude clinical specimens. Unfortunately, Professor Racaniello's discipline for terms really seems to fall apart when he goes on to say, this is a phylogenetic tree of 4,000 or so genome sequences of SARS-CoV-2 isolates. But then he goes on to recover from this slip and state that the dots are individual genome sequences which may or may not have an isolate associated with them. But can you see the major problem here? Detecting nucleic acid sequences does not equate to proof of a virus. In fact, the professor said so himself in his 2017 blog. Many laboratories choose to assay the presence of viral genomes by PCR. This is an acceptable technique as long as the limitations are understood. It detects nucleic acids, not infectious virus. However, even with the professor's stricter definition of isolate, that of a culture mixture, he's still not referring to a purified specimen. So in fact, how has it been determined that any of these 4,000 RNA sequences on the Next Strain website are viral in nature? You may be interested to know that the prize for providing the proof of isolation and genetic content for SARS-CoV-2 has jackpotted up to €1 million. Come on, virologists, surely that must interest you. So has this misuse in terminology happened recently in virology? It would seem no, going by this letter to the editor that appeared in The Lancet in 1978. C.R. Madeley, a virologist in Glasgow, and C.J. Kay from the Department of English Language at the University of Glasgow put forward their plea to clarify the language being used in virology. They stated, "An isolate may be defined as a microorganism grown in pure culture, and this implies that the organism has been grown, often through several passages, particularly for viruses, and is therefore available for further study, and that as far as can be determined, only one strain of the organism originating from the patient is present." With regards to other purported detection methods that were being used, they said to refer to positive results in these tests as isolates must be incorrect, since they have not been grown, nor can they be said to be free of other organisms. So over 40 years ago, they warned that isolate was a misnomer, but unfortunately it seems their warning was largely ignored. What actually goes on is at best detection through indirect methods or electron microscopy of unpurified specimens. With regards to this, you can watch my video COVID-19 Behind the PCR Curtain to see some of the problems with using PCR as a so-called detection test. And a quick word on the images you might see. Not the lurid computer-generated sea mines that the mainstream media love to show you, but electron micrograph images produced by researchers. Well, that's definitely not an isolate in the strict sense of the word, because it simply shows nanoparticles near a cell wall. Cells in culture grow, degenerate, and die, producing different nano-sized particles from the cell's surface. You may have heard terms such as exosomes or extracellular vesicles describing these particles, and you might not be surprised to hear that these terms have not been used consistently in the literature either. Speaking of poorly defined particles, I just discovered this gem of a publication that appeared in The Lancet last year. It seems that some groups producing these images are calling fraud on other groups' apparent virus images. They complain that the images in these publications show putative virus particles that lack sufficient ultrastructure for an unambiguous identification as virus. Unambiguous. Now that would be good to see. So back on topic, why on earth has all this murky terminology not been resolved in what should be a highly scientific field? After all, virologists say they've been isolating viruses for around a century now. One starts to wonder whether they are not all that enthusiastic about clearing up these terms because it shines a spotlight on one of their ticklish spots. Actual direct proof that they are isolating viruses in the true sense of the definition.
I've cut slices so thin, I couldn't even see them.
How'd you know you cut it?
Well, I guess I just assumed.
As you may realise, the repercussions for this are huge, and there will be further videos expanding on this in the future. Before I go, perhaps you'll find a little irony in this quote from Confucius. If language is not correct, then what is said is not what is meant. If what is said is not what is meant, then what must be done remains undone. If this remains undone, morals and art will deteriorate. If justice goes astray, the people will stand about in helpless confusion. Hence, there must be no arbitrariness in what is said. This matters above everything. To help sustain my channel in this time of censorship, please support my work on Subscribestar. Link is in the description.
Die Aussichten sind wirklich verzweifelnd. Es ist wirklich schlimm.